Okay, everyone, I think we'll begin.
Oh, Rhea, you're
I
here.
think not only is there competition from the clips, I think, I also have a feeling that I feel I lost a lot of people last week. And that was probably a pedagogical error of trying to read too much at one time. But there's something else also I wanted to talk about. I sensed, and this is to know one particular person, and certainly I want to be sensitive to people's own backgrounds, whether they come from Christianity or whether they have been hurt by Christianity in their years, is that it felt like there was quite a bit of defensiveness and maybe even not anger, but certainly that I didn't feel there was a willingness to read the text as it presents itself. There was kind of a second guessing, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'd like everybody to ask themselves that question when they read a text like this. How much are they able to actually read the text to hear what I won't say the narrator, but the editor of Matthew, I'm certainly not saying Matthew, whoever it was in the 80s and the 90s of the first century of the Common Era, what are they trying to tell us? And not so much, well, it's a new religion being born. The religion isn't being born yet. We're not at that stage of the development of history. This is an interpretation of Judaism, one of many, many interpretations of Judaism. And this is one of the interpretations that actually became rather successful, we might say. And the overall point I think I want to make in today, when we're going to go back to float, I'm going to hover over the text in Matthew to point out some of the things, to try to get a feeling for what might have been in the background, the Jewish background of this, which is very difficult because we don't have the writings we don't have that many writings of what became Rabbinic Judaism from the first century. We have nothing really. We have writings from the first century from in New Testament. We have from Philo, from Josephus. We have in the Qumran documents and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But to still get a sense for what I'd like to say is happening, although I can't say this academically. I wouldn't write an academic paper on this. A lot of this has to do with my looking at this from the viewpoint of interfaith dialogue, and especially the thorny part of it, where texts in the church have caused anti-Semitism or have fueled anti-Semitism or have um, uh, uh, you know you know yeah, fueled is a good word, or kept going anti-Semitism, even though there's often or almost always other reasons as well. And then also the way that we look at the other religion. What are the things that we're using in the sacred texts that I would say we've been misusing to posture? And how might we calm down with a lot of stuff, lower some of those barriers so we can have fruitful conversations. My ultimate goal would be for us as Jews, those Jews who are here, I'll speak to the Christians in a moment. I don't know everybody's background, but for us Jews to be open to what early Christianity might have to say about ourselves, and a kind of a critique and how we might improve, and vice versa as well. How Christians might see their texts and our text, our sacred texts, in a way that would help them grow. And sometimes that is not setting an example, but setting an example of exactly what not to do. Let me put it more plainly, and I think I've shared this with you before. A philosopher, Aviezer Ravitsky in Jerusalem, once said in the late 90s, there are three goals of dialogue, of getting along with people. The first one is tolerance. That's when I don't kill you and you don't kill me for having a different view and a different ideology and a different religion and a different nationality or whatever, politics. We don't kill each other. I'm being hyperbolic, of course, but I mean, tolerance is you, okay. The next step is pluralism. Pluralism is when I have my view and you have your view, and I recognize that for you, that is your truth. And I don't try to impart my truth on you. And you don't try to impart your truth on me. We respect. It's kind of, we agree to disagree, but we respectfully disagree. Truly respectfully disagree. But the ultimate goal, says Ravitsky, is for openness. And openness is when I have my view and you have your view or ideology or whatever it might be, and I visit you and I come in and I see maybe there's something in your truth for me, and you do the same. And that's what I'm striving for, the openness here. So if we can keep that in mind going forward, I should have given this introduction beforehand. But we're not in person. I can't read body language. I don't know all of you. I knew some of you through the screen, only through the screen for already for a few years now. But and even now, there's few of you who are actually showing your faces in real time. It's not a criticism. I understand people have different reasons for having the camera on. So I feel that in some ways, I'm responsible for far fewer people showing up today as well, and I'll try to learn from that for the future. What I'd like to do today is to go back to the text, and I'll put it up on the screen of Matthew, but to skip over from piece to piece. And what I feel tells us something about the Pesach Dike, right? The Passover-like background of this narrative. What I'd like everybody to keep in mind is something, again, I probably should have stated. I was going to save it for the end, but I realized, again, a pedagogical mistake. The destruction of the temple was catastrophic, not just for us in our own memory as Jews, that is, those who have followed the teachings of the rabbis who were the Pharisees, more or less, right? And those of the Babylonian Talmud, and those of us, most of us following Ashkenazic practices and sometimes ideologies, because sometimes there's a difference as well. In our understanding of Judaism, the catastrophe of the destruction, while it brought something new, still it left a vacuum. There was a huge space that was left, and so our Judaism, let's call it rabbinic Judaism for now, and Christianity, which was a type of Judaism in the first century, they filled that vacuum in very different ways, but the vacuum needed to be filled. We filled it with prayer, with 3 times a day, with mitzvot, with halacha, with agadah, with all sorts of things. Everything that the Judaism became, we filled the vacuum of the centrality of the temple. We don't always think of that, but it really was a central piece to the religion of Israel. Christianity filled it in a very different way. And Pesach, what I'm saying, is a focal point in that filling of the vacuum. We have a lot to learn. And that's kind of what I'd like to do today, as we're going to stick to the sheets, and next week when I'll provide some new texts from other parts of the New Testament for us to reflect on as well, with this overreaching kind of thing, about how was the vacuum filled after the destruction of the temple. The last introductory point that I will make is that we're reading Leviticus right now for those that follow the Torah portion, Parshat HaShavua. And although we had a break for a story, the death of Aaron's sons, and we're going to get into what's called the Holiness Code now. But the first part of Leviticus is dedicated to sacrifices and purity and impurity, right? Or there's more to come, but the centrality of the offerings, of the priestly culture of the Hebrew Bible, which lived on to a certain extent, but became until the destruction of the temple. The main vessel for communication between the people of Israel and God was thought to be the temple. That's the centrality of the temple all throughout Scripture. And after the destruction of the first temple, that was the yearning towards, and the rebuilding of the second temple was a big issue. And although there are other expressions of Judaism, surely many other expressions, still the temple is a central part. Of all the things that have to do with offerings, and offerings seem to be a central part of so many religions, as Rambam, as Maimonides pointed out 1,000 years later, is the only one that wasn't really tied to the temple in the beginning was the Passover sacrifice. It was meant to be a home sacrifice, a family sacrifice. And while it morphed into something connected to the temple during the Second Temple period, the original idea was and even in the Second Temple period, you took the meat that was sacrificed and then you brought it out to your family. It was a very familial experience or a clan kind of experience, but not dominated by the priests during the entire time, right? And so that's why Passover becomes a key, I think, a key piece in what happened, what filled the vacuum afterwards, not only for Christians, but also for Jews. If we fast forward 2,000 years, really, what from a people who remember things, I think people remember a lot more from their Seder growing up, those that practice, than from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in synagogue. I know people talk about the high holidays a lot, but I think that a lot of my experience as a rabbi, as an educator over the years, is that a lot of the what people carry around from their Jewishness comes from the Seder. And that's because it's such a wonderful occasion for education, for experiences, for taste, for food, all the senses together, the family, for good, for bad, it all comes together with that Passover experience. Um, okay, I know you could argue that about Hanukkah as well. I'm guessing less about Purim, certainly less about Shavuot and Sukkot. But I think that Passover is maybe less today for younger people, but certainly for those of us of the age of people who are here, and I think I'm one of the youngest. And yeah, okay. So any comments or reactions to what I just spent the last 10 minutes introducing, or am I? Okay. Yes, go ahead, Sylvia.
I just want to say that I didn't. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I don't think that that was necessarily a mistake how you introduced this topic. It's very complex for all of us because we do all have feelings, and we live in an age where many people have been hurt by Christianity. And for me, myself, I wasn't, but I didn't, because I started out as a Christian, but I didn't choose Judaism because I hated Christianity.
Mhm.
I chose Judaism because I knew where I belonged by the time I converted. So I don't necessarily agree that it was a mistake. It's just,
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. Thanks for the encouragement then. Uh, all right. Yeah, yes, Ria.
So the first time that I realized the text, some of the texts, Christian texts, the Gospels, how it affected me through some of the anti-Semitic incidents that happened in my childhood was when I went to a concert and Bach's, it's the Passion,
Passion.
I think it's St. John, but
Yeah, Passion of St.
essentially
John.
the
Yeah.
same story is told. And so they ran the choir was singing, and everything. And so they ran the words across the wall. And when I saw that, it's the very first time that I realized what the kids that were yelling at me about being a dirty Jew, where they had gotten that information. And it was so shocking.
Mhm.
I had no idea. And so you put it forward as one of the texts in not that emotional kind of setting, but we have to admit that these influence how people interacted with one another in terrible ways.
Yes, yes, I agree. I might just add from my point of view, not what you were saying, is that I'm not always sure that that was the source of anti-Semitism. I'm not sure that's what you were saying, but I think that was the fuel. That's the word I was getting. It kept it going very much
Well,
on a set.
these are the words that the kids would yell in one sense, not the
Yeah,
formal words.
I understand.
Christ killer, and all the rest of that.
Yeah, I understand. And by the way, the gospel according to John is more difficult in that way to sensitive Jewish ears because of the continuous talking about the Jews, the Jews. If you're interested in that, I'm going to be co-teaching a class, actually going step by step. As many of you know, you've been with me. I love this step by step, chapter by chapter study of an entire book. I'm doing the Gospel according to John with Dr. Stephen Kinney, who's a Episcopal priest and PhD scholar of New Testament in Austin, Texas. We've been teaching quite a bit over the last few years together. We just did Second Isaiah, and before that, we did the Acts of the Apostles together. And we co-teach, and we're going to be doing the Gospel according to John. And one of the things that we're going to be bringing, or I'm going to be bringing up, I would imagine as well, is a late 20th century approach to it, that John is actually a Jewish gospel. It's a very Jewish gospel, not something that was said over the world. But if that and that and one of the reason that I really got involved in these texts was to try to defang some of that emotion, some of that hatred. In the original course that I did in this version of David Lazar, the last 3-4 years since the pandemic, was from holiness to hatred and back. And I spoke about this briefly when I did a survey, I think it was last year, on the interfaith dialogue things I was doing. The idea was to take texts that are sacred in both traditions, but in this particular case in Christianity, the holiness, how they fueled or caused or played a part in the hatred, and then back. In other words, and the back part was added by my partner at the time, Father Andrew Green, who's an Episcopal priest who retired, a very close friend of mine out here. And we were doing this project together, and he says, well, we need to talk about the redemption of those texts as well. And I've since bought a book, which I haven't read yet, which has to do with redeeming violent texts in scriptural texts. Whereas that's something that I'd like to do instead of skipping over them, instead of saying, well, that was then and now is now. What might we learn from that? But that's for another course, not for today. Yes, Chuck.
I thought last week was just fine.
Okay.
I think we had to go into the depth. There's an old saying, Kol hatchala kasha.
Okay.
All beginnings are difficult. We had to do that in order to get to where we are now. So, kol hakavod.
Thank you. Kolat chalot kashod indeed is a noble anyway, the rabbis use that especially about Abraham and Sarah, right? It's a compliment that I accepted. Let's go to the text now, okay? I'm going to put up, and you're going to have to speak out again. I'm not good at seeing hands when I've got the text open. Let's get to the text. Okay, so you can either follow on your sheet if you have it printed out, or you can look at the screen. I'm going to be consulting my notes here. The first thing is the context. After 2 days, Passover is coming in the first paragraph. So we know from the narrator here that we're talking about Passover. And then there's this comment about, but let's not do it during the festival because there might be a riot among the people. Maybe I'm stating screen sharing is stopped. I don't know why that's happening. Try it again. Apologies. Okay. Does that work? All right.
Yes.
So not during the festival. Okay. Perhaps stating the obvious. Passover is one of the 3 pilgrimage holidays. The city was crowded. And this taking into consideration all the people that would be there and the support that Jesus would have amongst those people, that's something that's the backdrop of a festive holiday, but also a crowded holiday in Jerusalem itself. As we go down to the next paragraph, many of you mentioned about, or a number of you mentioned about the part of the woman place here, and her wanting to anoint and spend the money. And what do we spend money on? We talked a little bit about that last week. You know what? I'm going to go through a page or so, and this. So hold your comments, and then I'll pause from the text. I'll go back and see everybody. But if you see in the second paragraph, she poured it over his head as he sat at the table. He's sitting at the table, bringing into this idea that people are in a family-like situation, even though this is somebody else's house. It's not noteworthy that it's Simon the leopard, Hamitzurah, the one who is an outcast, and that's where Jesus is sitting at the table and spending the money on something very, very specific. Think of just fast forward 2,000 years. Think of how many times those of us that keep kosher for Pesach and those of us in our lives that have kept very kosher for Pesach, how much money we've spent just to restock the kitchen and all the disposable things before we learned a little bit more about the environment. All the money that was spent for Pesach, how much Pesach things cost, Passover things cost, Shmura matzah, all the things. I can think of all the money I have spent over the years on Shmura matzah, on special handmade matzah, because for me, that's the quintessential part of the Seder, is to have handmade matzah. That's the thing that I spoil myself with in the family. But spending a lot of money on something that happens in the house and the family, again, the anointment has nothing to do with Pesach directly, although it will actually. I'll show it will. We're going to wait for that in a second. But the fact that spending money and giving money to the poor people, to those who are needy, is an issue that's brought up. So before Passover, as we're going to see from the Mishnah a little bit later, these 4 cups of wine that have to be supplied by the community to the poor people. I'm skipping over to the paragraph of 17 to 19 now. Again, you eat your Passover. You're eating you're eating the meat, the sacrifice that was done in the temple, but then the meat was brought to people's homes by this time during the Second Temple period. Looking at paragraph 20 to 25, here's something which, again, I don't know that I would take academic responsibility for saying this, but there's quite a bit in halachic literature about dipping the maror into the charoset, and then later on it becomes the dipping of karpas into salt water or vinegar. The idea, though, dipping, and if you have dipped in your hand in the bowl, it's kind of like when we Israeli slang. I don't know if there's any Israelis here, if any of you lived in Israel for a long time, but when you say nostalgically about someone you were in the army with and you shared the bare minimum you had, we used to eat from the same mess kit. Mesting is mess kit, mesting. This idea of the intimacy. So he's going to be betrayed by someone who dipped his hand. That is, I would like to say here, dip the maror in the charoset, which again, we'll see from the Mishnah onwards, becomes a thing for the Passover evening. I'll go back to this afterwards, but I will talk about the relationship between the Mishnah, which was written quite a bit after, or documented quite a bit after this, but just ideas that come to me as I read this now. We get to 26 to 35, and for this we're going to go back a little while, though. We're going to go back to the passage in Exodus. We're going to wait for that, though, but the idea that the blood, there's cups of wine, there's blood involved. What do you do with the cup, with the wine, with the blood? How does that all come together and come into something new? And the blood of the covenant. What does a covenant have to do with this? I'm just lifting these as questions right now we're going to go back to. And drinking in, then we get to my Father's kingdom, the idea that there is a kingdom, there must be a king. Who is the king? In this case, Jesus saying, my Father is the king, my Father's kingdom, meaning Adonai, God. But we're going to talk more about kingdom and who is the king. And then finally, when they had sung the hymn, this is agreed by, I think, by all scholars here, is the hymn is not just one psalm, but the collection of psalms which comprise the Hallel, which are said at the night, in the evening of Passover. Again, this is not teaching us anything we don't know from Jewish sources, but it's kind of reassigning it to a different function here. It becomes the end of the holiday, of the observance in the house, and then they go out to Mount Olives, which I mentioned last week. I don't think it's coincidental that there was anointing of olive oil. They go to Mount Olives, and there's Gat Shemen is mentioned here as well, the place of the olive press because of the importance of olive oil, which I'll get to. We'll go back to when we talk about who is the king. There's another element that's introduced here, and that is, I will take the shepherd and the sheep of the flock. Right? Some of you know, again, fast forwarding to the importance of Jesus as the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei in Christianity, but and that's mixed up with other things as well. Mixed up, I don't mean in a negative way. I mean it's combined. It's with the idea of Isaac being substituted by a lamb to be, or a goat to be one of the flock to be sacrificed in his stead. Isaac, the son who wasn't sacrificed, the sacrifice that didn't work, and this is Jesus, the one that did work. That's not part of Pesach, but it all goes into this mixture. We go down to, as I mentioned, Gethsemane, which is Gat Shemen in Hebrew, the idea of the oil here. Again, let this cup pass from me, centrality of the cup. And then we get to that part which stay awake and pray until the time of the trial. What's this whole thing of staying awake? And then he gets mad at them afterwards that they couldn't stay awake. This idea from the story that we have, which is a complex story from the 2nd century. We're not sure exactly. There's different theories as to what it is exactly. Were the rabbis in a cave practicing the Pesach because they were afraid of the Romans, or were they so engrossed in their conversations, in the discussions of the Exodus of Mitzrayim, that they didn't know? But one way or another, it's the students coming to tell the rabbis it's the morning. The crow it's time for the morning. All the things that have to do with morning, because all night the custom was to talk about the Exodus from Egypt. We'll see that again in 1232. So we're going to skip to 5764 now, but let's take a break for any, because I feel I shouldn't be talking this much at one time. Any reactions or questions as to what I mentioned now? I hope you get a feeling for what I'm doing, my process. My process here is reading the text. I don't see my process as a writer, as a musician. That's not the process I'm talking about. This process of study is to look at a text, and you had to take that whole thing, as some of you mentioned last week. You've got to see the whole story from the eve of Passover to the resurrection. That's how the Christianity tells the story. I chose Matthew because I feel it's the most Jewish in it's the one I have the most experience with. And John sees it differently and splits it up into different parts. Passover becomes something very different. It's not the Last Supper in the other 3 Gospels, though. The Seder is or some form of it is the Last Supper. And then I'll go back and see, okay, and on the way I'll circle and think, what reminds me of Pesach? Now, again, not academic and not purely academic, because what reminds me of Pesach could be influenced by things that happened in the Middle Ages, right? Or things that happened in the 20th century. If suddenly there was if it said something about the sun was going down and the horizon was orange, it didn't say that. But if it said that, somebody might say, oh, that's just like the orange at the Seder table. But of course, we know the orange at the Seder table is a late 20th century invention connected to Susanna Heschel. Anyway, any questions or comments about without having to understand all the details yet? We're going to go back and we're going to look at the passage from Exodus, one of the passages from Exodus, and we're going to go to the Mishnah, and then I'll kind of sum it up at the end of the end of our hour. Okay, so I can go ahead. All right. There's a few. 57 to 64. Let's remember that this is post-destruction of the temple, in which the simple Jew, I think, would have said, oh no, there is no God's presence. God is not present among us. God's not with us anymore. And the temple is destroyed, and what comes instead? This is why it's so important. This is not the only passage in the Gospels that talks about this, the destruction of the temple. And he says, I am able to destroy the temple of God, the bold part, to build it in 3 days. What is that about? What is that about? And the fact that Jesus doesn't answer, that's to be mysterious, but the message is there because the questions have been asked. And I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of God, man, seated at the right hand of power. In other words, will become one with God, or I will become closer to God. In other words, the way I understand this is being written after the destruction of the temple, when people felt that God's presence was no longer with the people. There was no, this is the presence instead now is through the being of Jesus, who spent 30 whatever years with the people on the earth, and then comes back and is present with the people, and yet it becomes that conduit between God and the people, as opposed to the temple, which was the conduit between God and the people beforehand. Skipping down to 27. Again, when the morning came, that idea that of the Higias Man Kriyat Shema, the students coming in to tell I hope everybody knows what I'm referring to, the story of the rabbis in the sitting in a cave or in private someplace, not realizing the sun has come up. So again, and also the idea in the middle of the night is part of the Passover story, if you remember. And the morning is a new reality when the firstborn had been slain by the destructor. I'm turning now to the second page, to the third page. Just a note about this, if we had one time, this is a fascinating piece here, not so much connected to Pesach, although perhaps there is a Passover connection, but not that one I can see right now, is the idea of the potter's field. And it's been renamed the field of blood. There's two different names in Greek for the field of blood, one here and one in the Acts of the Apostles, but it was known as a place, and it became a cemetery, for a pauper's cemetery. Those that couldn't afford to be buried were buried in that place, which might be some sort of sign of forgiveness as well for the betrayal, Judas's betrayal. Okay, 11 to 14, we get to the issue of king. How is this connected to Passover? When you think of it, let me say this. This is kind of a central piece. When you think of Pesach, of the Exodus, Yetziat Mitzrayim, from a biblical perspective, from the perspective of the Torah, until that moment, you had a tribe that was slowly growing larger and larger from Avram and Sarai onwards. It grows onwards. Then we have the story of how they got down there and they become more and more, and they become a threat to the Egyptians. The Egyptians, according to the story, I'm not talking about reality or history here, and they're enslaved and they try to be put down, but as much as they're put down, they grow and they grow and grow. So they're growing and growing and growing. But until this moment, the truth is, until chapter 12 of Exodus, when even though there's back and forth between Moses and the people who are bent over the hardship of the slavery, until the commandment to sanctify the new moon, and this was the section that was read in the second Torah scroll that was read this week in synagogue, Parshat HaChodesh, you've got, this is when the people become a people, a nation. God becomes Adonai becomes the God of Israel at Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's kind of that's how the arc of the history is spread out in Genesis to Exodus, or through the Torah, let's just say in the 5 books of Moses. God becomes the king, the ultimate king of Israel, the King of Kings, Melech Malchei Amlachim, at the point of the Exodus, because God shows that no human being can subdue another human being, turns the world upside down, almost does an uncreation with the 10 plagues, and splits the sea. All this whole story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, comes to place God, Adonai, in the throne of the King of Kings. And the presence of the temple afterwards was this, oh, God is with us. God is with us. The smoke going up from the altar, the fire that was burning, Esha Tamid, all the in and outs and the things that were around, all the centrality of the temple offerings. And then that was broken. So the question is, where is the king? Who is the king? That's why this paragraph I think is important. And you might say, well, we talk about kings in later Judaism, but based on the Babylonian background of biblical Judaism at the time of Rosh Hashanah in the seventh month, yeah, we have a lot of that kingship and the kingship of God is a leitmotif all throughout our high holiday liturgy. But I would argue that here in Pesach, from a Torah point of view, this is when God, whereas Rosh Hashanah is not important in the Torah, or less important. This is where God becomes the king of the people of Israel. Okay. Okay. Well, this will take another few minutes, and then we'll open it up for conversation. 24, 26. Again, the academic issue is I would be very careful in putting any of this in writing, an article, but I feel free to speak about it here. You've got this issue of washing the hands of the blood, and this is a common motif. Of an entire sheet of sources from the letter of Aristeas, which is a part of the apocryphal, kind of an introduction to apocryphal literature as used as, because it's an introduction to the translation of the Septuagint. So so in those hundreds of years in that time, there's a lot about washing oneself. But let's remember also that in order to be part of the Passover celebration, you had to be pure, you had to be washed. So this idea of washing, even though it's the other, it's Pilatus who's talking about the washing of the hands, it brings up that motif. Go down to 38:44. Again, we have this issue of who is the king, the destroying of the temple, and why did I put for? Oh, and third up here, I forgot. The idea that they offered him wine to drink. He had said, "I'm not going to taste wine until the end of days." You might remember that again, the centrality of wine in this narrative, and the cup and the wine, so central to the Seder, what became the Seder as well. And already there's buds of this in the first century. Going down to Eli Eli lama azavtani, which in Aramaic would have been sabachthani or shavachtani. The idea that Eli Eli lama, they heard Eli Eli as in Eliyahu, and the idea that Elijah and the connection. This one is a little bit more tenuous. I'm not sure from what point we could say historically. I think I know who's written about it, but I don't remember what point historically we'd say Elijah is part of the Passover experience, but who knows? Elijah is for another, maybe not because not a cup of Elijah, which is a late development, certainly post-Talmudic, but based on an idea that there's 5 cups. But Elijah is the one who is the harbinger of the coming of the Messiah. So this idea of Messiah being the anointed one to be king, this whole motif of king, who is the king of Israel, Elijah coming to, and connected to this kind of misunderstanding or mishearing of Jesus saying the beginning of that psalm, Eli, Eli. The earth shook, the rocks were split. To me, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea, there's kind of a mini exodus is going on here. Something has happened in which there's been a paradigm shift in this particular thing. It's all about salvation. Who's going to be saved is here as well. Can Jesus save himself? Okay, I think we've done enough for now. There's more to be said, especially when we come to hear this complex issue of the timing of the crucifixion over what day, what was Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And I actually pleaded with you last week not to try to do the chronology because it gets us sidetracked. Instead, I take a step back and say, what we have here is a story that brings up so many motifs from the Pesach practice and experience, from the Passover experience. and what and because it's such a central holiday for the family, which originally was done outside of the temple, certainly before the first temple period, or the way it's described in the Torah, as we'll see in a second, or partially see. This made it an opportune time to show this whole paradigm shift. The paradigm shift was from the temple and the destruction of the temple to the new understanding of how God's presence is felt in the world, and that will be through Jesus. And so I would offer a kind reading in saying that everybody deals with catastrophe and grief in a different way. And the way that the early church, certainly parts of the early church, dealt with it was, we need something to fill this vacuum. The rabbis went in a different direction. But that's what I want to, that's kind of the overall thing that I'm saying. And this is nothing, that's not a novel idea from me. But this is my reading of the text might be perhaps a little bit novel. So reactions or comments before we go on to look at the Mishnah and Exodus. Or if you'd like to save it, we can do it at the end. Yes, Ria.
Sorry for, I keep, anyway, it's about the concept of king. So this is a big deal here about God being the king, and yet there's the book of Kings, but the people want a king, and God communicates that, are you sure you want a king? These are the things that a king will do, which Solomon really did, the money, the control of people, and it didn't turn out well for the Jews, having all these kings. They were corrupt and all kinds of stuff. So how does this fit with the idea of don't have a king? Does it fit under the thing of God being king?
Yeah.
Or does it not relate at all?
Yeah, well, no, it certainly relates, but what you haven't mentioned are all the voices in which the king was important. In fact, the entire book of Judges says all this mess of not completing the dominion of the land is because there was no king in Israel. So they're competing voices. It's complicated. It's a nuance. To say what does Hebrew scripture say about the king in Israel? It's a complicated thing. Yes, it's a story of the downfall. It's that more of the kings are schmucks than are good guys,
Yes.
right?
So does this fit into that narrative?
I hear the question. So I think yes, because what it's doing, it's elevating the king from a flesh and blood king who ends up sinning to a heavenly being, to part of God. This is before the Trinity still, but it's elevating. Jesus will become with God, sitting God's right hand, yet also present. It's a new way. It's a new form of kingship, if you will. But the kingship is very much part of it. All the anointing that's done, all the talk of the king. You say you're the king of Israel. All these kinds of things. So yeah, the answer is yeah. I think it is connected to it, and it provides another solution. It didn't work. Look at I'm going to use this word. I don't always use it. I mean, use the term the Old Testament, what we call the Hebrew Bible, rightfully so. But from a classical Christian point of view, is that the Old Testament didn't work out. It's like, how's that working out for you guys? It's not working. That's why we need a new one, right? We need a new covenant with God. I'm oversimplifying, but yeah. So I'm glad you raised that question. The king is central to this. Now, we don't think of the king so much in Passover in our experience, do we? But because there is talk about the Mashiach and Eliyahu and towards the end, that's not really that's later additions to the Haggadah. But in essence, we are talking about it. Who's not in the Haggadah?
God is not.
No. God is on every page.
Oh, wait, so Moses, I mean.
The kibbutz movement's Haggadot would take out God. Yes,
Jesus. Moses.
Jesus is certainly not in the Haggadah, not in ours, but is probably in a messianic Haggadah. I don't know. That would be interesting to see.
But Moses is not. Yeah.
I think that's there's that that's leaving it open. That goes to support, Ria, what you were saying beforehand. It's about God. It's not about human beings. Not even Moses. Not even Moses. That would be
So humans are not elevated above other humans.
yeah. In general, I would say that's me as a 21st century progressive liberal rabbi saying that's the whole point of Passover. The whole point of Passover is for us to learn that even whoever is your servant, whatever, should sit with you at the table, that even the poorest of the poor gets the luxurious thing of having minimum 4 cups of wine, all the things that whole experience of we're going to lean, on the other hand, we're going to eat the bread of affliction. All those 10 things is to show human beings shall not dominate other human beings. That's why the most opportune time to talk about civil rights in the Jewish calendar, I would say, would be this. But I'm going to cut it short now. I want to go to the other parts of the text, and then we'll go back to the conversation. I promise. And if we need to, we'll go over again. So here's something from the Babylonian Talmud, and this is a tricky topic. Jesus and other things in Talmudic and rabbinic literature, because there was a censor, as you may have known, that took out a lot of the stuff, and some of it has been re-put back in there, some by Steinsaltz, and there are other manuscripts. There's the Florence manuscript of Sanhedrin, the Babylonian Talmud, has a much more detailed story here, and that would be fascinating to itself. But my only point here is to show, Ria, as long as you're on the screen, why don't you read this for us from Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin? This is in the context of how you put somebody to death.
Yeah, wow. Okay. And it was taught on the eve of Passover, Yeshua, the Nazarene, was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He's going forth to be stoned, because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come and plead on his behalf." And since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. Wow.
Okay, just to plug this book, this is a really good book by Peter Schaefer, an important scholar of New Testament in Germany. And it's a really important book to understand that period of time of Jewish literature and the context. Now, a lot of things are said. If it's in the Babylonian Talmud, it was edited, right, in another place hundreds and hundreds of years later, right? It's not to be confused. The Mishnah is closer. The Mishnah is from, which is the basis of the Babylonian Talmud, which I think most of you know, is edited, oral traditions that are edited and written down in the beginning of the 3rd century. But at least it's the land of Israel. At least it's oral traditions there. So it's not contemporary, yet we have here a voice from, and by the way, this is in a Braita, which means that it's attributed to the first few centuries of the Common Era. It's written in that kind of a Hebrew. There's a voice here which seems to be a little bit apologetic, I would say. In other words, the recognition, this is not silence on the issue of Yeshua. Of course, it totally recontextualizes the story. Yeshua is not offering another legitimate view of Judaism in the Pharisaic tradition of questioning and kind of talking about competing values. Those that have read through the Gospels, especially Matthew, know what I'm talking about. You know, where does the needs of the needy come ahead of what is perceived to be God's will when it comes to Shabbat, when it comes to other things, purity, and so it's recognized, but recontextualized and say, well, that's because he was a sorcerer, and that's because he led people to, well, yeah, according to rabbinic tradition, he led them astray because he was not part of that tradition. There's also this idea that a voice went out. In other words, that somebody could have come forward in 40 days, in those 40 days beforehand, to say, oh, no, don't kill him, don't kill him, don't kill him, to defend, and there was no defense, so to speak. So That's just to let you know that Rabbinic Judaism is conscious, and this is a shortened version of it. As I say, the Florence manuscript of the Talmud has a much longer version, and perhaps another day we can do that as well. That's on our list of another time we might do things together. Okay. Any comments or questions about what we read, what Ria read in the Talmud? But what I really want to get to, and where the other sources that you have in your sheet have to do with the idea of the world to come and resurrection and things like that. But let's take a look at just a short excerpt from the Exodus story. Let's see. Rosalie, would you like to read? Just need you to unmute.
This is letter D, right?
Correct.
Okay. Moses then summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go pick out lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover offering. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts. None of you shall go outside the door of your house until morning. For God, when going through to smite the Egyptians, will see the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and God will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your home. You shall observe this as an institution for all time, for you and for your descendants. And when you enter the land that God will give you, as promised, you shall observe this rite."
Okay. I'm guessing this looks a little bit different after reading Matthew, right? I'm hoping this piece that many of us have seen over the years, Parshat HaShavua, or in preparation for, just to look out the thing, again, the emphasis here is families, the lambs from the family, the slaughter. Passover offering is not a temple. It wasn't done in the tabernacle. It wasn't done in the temple. It was a family thing. Hyssop, by the way, hyssop is just it's the same family as oregano. It's what we call zatar. I think many of you like to have. That's what hyssop is. Grows all over Eretz Yisrael, and it's a natural paintbrush because the way that the leaves are structured, they hold liquid, so you can use it as a paintbrush, and it's used in a lot of in the temple set. It's used in the paraduma and the red cow rite. In any case, blood is pretty central to this, right? There's a lot of blood. What is the goal of the blood here? What's the purpose of the blood? Anybody? This is a new word. I see it every year, but I can never. I think it's apot.
Passover the doors.
Right. Therefore, therefore, what's the function of the blood?
As a marker, but yeah.
Marker to protect.
Right.
Protect.
Right. The blood is protection. If you take again, it's hard for me because we do I do these. I'm working on a different groups, whatever. But recently, with a group, we were looking at how blood functions in many of the sacrifices in Korban Chatat, which used to be called the sin offering. Now we usually call as the purging or purgation offering. It's a little bit different. It's not about you've done something wrong. It's that the temple, the sacred space needs, you need a spiritual detergent of sorts, a sacred detergent, and so the blood in most cases, in the priestly way, the blood is not about protection. The blood is for atonement. Yeah, let's see. In the story of Jesus, are we talking about the first temple time? Yes, the end. So in Matthew is thought to be written in the 80s and 90s of the first century after the destruction, but the stories of Jesus are very much at the end of the final first temple century, the first temple. Yeah. So the blood here functions very, very differently, and this is where we get a lot of the blood of Christ. It functions as well to protect the people, but also the atonement. That's a combination of both, right? It's a fusion of both things together. But in what we have here is from a Pesach point of view, is that this blood of Christ now, which he talks about symbolically. By the way, when you're crucified, you're not. It's not a bloody thing. You die of asphyxiation. I think you don't die of a loss of blood, and yeah. Okay. So we've got you don't go out until the morning we had before. Let me put the text back up a second. Oh, we're already at the end. Oh. You should know in other it's always with the Jewish Collaborative Orange County, I mismanage my time. Usually I'm very good. I bite off exactly what we need. So as other people here can attribute that usually okay, but any case, I think part of it is because Rabbi Marcia is always asking me to do, she's asking me to do stuff, and it's almost always new stuff. What I do is almost always new, and if it's new, means that I haven't gauged exactly how much time is going to take. But if I'm looking at the text here, the things that come up are the lambs in the first line, in the Passover offering, of course. In the second, the hyssop and the blood, all the blood that comes to protect. After that, to stay in your house until the morning. That motif came up in Matthew as well in the description. More of the blood. Do not let the destroyer enter. Is that evil part of the world, the part which leaves us unprotected. Jesus now will come to protect, I think. An institution for all time, meaning the Passover is not dependent. This is important. Passover is not dependent upon the temple. So if the temple is destroyed, something else like Passover fills its place. Yeah. Okay. And I think what we're going to do is take some comments or questions, and totally not my plan, but I got to roll with the punches here. We're going to start at least with the Mishnah next week, and hopefully get a little bit to some of the other parts of the New Testament as well, to see what John did and to see what maybe what Paul did before that. And the earliest parts from a chronological point of view are Paul's writings. Comments or questions on what we did today? Everybody wants to get out and see the sun. Okay. All right then. Well, thank you for being. I appreciate particularly everybody's here on this day of the eclipse, and we'll see each other next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.